How can a war be described as cooling down when the bombs are still dropping, the walls are still going up, and the people calling it peace are also demanding surrender? That is the real story behind today's headlines. Today's coverage looks scattered at first glance. U.S. strikes near Iran, negotiations in Doha, Israeli escalation in Lebanon, and a so-called Gaza ceasefire that is turning into something much more permanent on the ground. But once you line the reports up side by side, a pattern starts to emerge. This is not just diplomacy. It is pressure management, territorial control, and a public narrative that keeps leaving out the most important details. And if this kind of breakdown is useful, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The first thing to understand is that the headlines are trying to make this look like a normal negotiation cycle. Some military pressure, some shuttle diplomacy, and maybe a deal in a few days if everyone stays calm. That version is convenient, but it is also incomplete. According to the reports, the U.S. struck vessels near Bandar Abbas and described it as self-defense. Iran says its forces shot down a Reaper drone that entered Iranian airspace. At the same time, top Iranian officials traveled to Doha for continued talks through mediators. So the same story contains strikes, counterstrikes, and diplomacy all at once. That matters because it undercuts the idea that we are watching a stable ceasefire. We are not. We are watching a live conflict being relabeled as a negotiation. Now look at the actual terms being discussed. A senior Iranian official told DropSite that Tehran has put forward a framework that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz only provisionally, and only if the U.S. ends its blockade on Iranian ports, releases billions in frozen assets, and agrees to compensation for war damage. In other words, Iran is not asking for a symbolic pause. It is asking for an end to the pressure campaign that made the conflict possible in the first place. That sequencing is the heart of the dispute. Iran wants the war ended first, then the nuclear file discussed. Washington wants the nuclear issue folded into the same package, with sanctions relief tied to everything else. Those are not minor technical differences, they are competing visions of who gets to declare victory, and on what terms. And the mainstream framing tends to soften that conflict into vague language like both sides are making progress or a deal could take a few days. Marco Rubio says it might take only a few days, but that also hides the fact that the U.S. is still hitting targets while the talks are ongoing. That is not a neutral backdrop, that is leverage. Trump makes it even more revealing. He demands that countries in the talks sign the Abraham Accords as part of the deal, which is a way of turning a narrow war-ending negotiation into a regional political loyalty test. It is one thing to talk about nuclear limits. It is another to tell Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, and Bahrain that a settlement with Iran should somehow also normalize Israel's regional order. That is where the story stops being about one conflict and starts looking like a broader attempt to force an entire region into compliance. What gets left out in a lot of coverage is the asymmetry. When the U.S. strikes near Iranian waters, the label is self-defense. When Iran resists or threatens retaliation, the language becomes provocation or escalation. That framing makes sense only if you assume Washington's military actions are naturally defensive and everyone else's are naturally aggressive. But that assumption is exactly what should be questioned. There is also the nuclear issue itself, which gets stripped down into slogans. The White House insists Iran can never possess a nuclear weapon and cannot keep enriched uranium, but reports keep noting that no intelligence assessment has concluded Iran was on the verge of building one. That doesn't settle the debate, but it does raise the obvious question. Are these negotiations really about preventing a bomb, or are they about using the bomb as a justification to reorder the whole region? And that is why Iranian officials keep talking about frozen assets, maritime access, compensation, and ending hostile action on all fronts, including Lebanon. From Tehran's perspective, this is not a single-file nuclear discussion. It is a larger war settlement. Washington, meanwhile, seems determined to isolate the nuclear file so it can preserve its pressure tools elsewhere. The result is a talks process where both sides say they want peace, but neither side is pretending the pressure has stopped. If the Iran story is about leverage, Gaza is about something even more chilling, the conversion of a ceasefire into a physical redesign of the territory. Forensic Architecture's latest analysis says Israel has built more than 25 kilometers of earthen barriers inside Gaza since the ceasefire. These berms do not just sit there as rubble. They divide the strip, reinforce Israeli control, and squeeze Palestinians into less than half of the enclave. Israeli forces are also fortifying 38 military bases along the eastern side of the territory they control. That is a huge detail because it means the ceasefire is not functioning like a pause before withdrawal. It is functioning like a phase of consolidation. Mainstream coverage often treats ceasefire violations as isolated incidents, like the agreement is somehow intact except for the occasional breach. But this reporting suggests something much bigger. The map itself is being changed while the world keeps using the word ceasefire, as if it means the conflict is shrinking. It isn't. The control line is becoming a wall. The yellow line matters here. Israel originally withdrew to that line under the October 2025 deal, which already left it with control of more than half the strip. Since then, the reports say control has expanded past 60%. In some areas, Israel has created buffer zones by destroying everything within 300 meters. That is not just military positioning, that is spatial erasure. And then there is the language from the Palestinian side, which is much more honest than the official version. One academic quoted in the reporting described the ceasefire as something being read like an event, instead of a process. That distinction is crucial. If people think the war ended, they stop noticing the slow violence that happens after the cameras move on. That is exactly what the walling off of Gaza is doing, turning politics into geography. When a population cannot be removed outright, it is contained, narrowed, fenced, and made harder to live around. The official story is security. The actual effect is engineered uninhabitability. This is where the Board of Peace angle becomes important too. Reports say Trump's board has unilaterally rewritten the Gaza ceasefire terms to pressure Hamas into surrendering its liberation cause, while Israeli forces continue occupying most of the strip. That means the so-called peace process is not neutral mediation. It is a mechanism for imposing a new order without Palestinians agreeing to it. And the number that should stick with you is this. More than 900 Palestinians have reportedly been killed in Gaza since October, many near the yellow line. So while the language says ceasefire, the reality says ongoing lethal control. That gap between word and reality is where a lot of the coverage breaks down. The public hears ceasefire and imagines relief. But on the ground, the strip is being physically split, militarized, and boxed in. That is not peace, that is administrative warfare. Lebanon is the other side of the same coin. Israeli officials talk about an offensive against Hezbollah, but the casualty pattern looks much broader than that. One report says at least 31 people were killed and 40 wounded in a single day of strikes in southern Lebanon. Another says more than 120 airstrikes were launched over the course of the day, while evacuation orders were issued for 50 municipalities. Hospitals were struck, rescue teams were hit, and entire communities were told to move again. That is the part you rarely hear emphasized enough. Displacement is not a side effect here. It is part of the operating method. Israeli forces are pushing farther north, beyond the area they originally framed as the line of operation. The Litani River is supposed to be the major boundary in public explanations, but the actions on the ground show that boundary has already been treated as flexible. Once that happens, every limited operation starts to look like a rolling advance, and that is what makes the media language so slippery. If a hospital gets hit, the headline often becomes new escalation in the south. If rescue workers die, the discussion shifts to tactical necessity. If a whole city is ordered to evacuate, the story is still folded into the logic of border security. But ask a simpler question: what does security mean if it is measured by how far a population can be pushed back? There is also a direct connection to the Iran talks that often gets minimized. Iranian officials have reportedly said that ending hostile action on all fronts, including Lebanon, is a condition for any agreement. That means Lebanon is not just a separate front, it is a bargaining chip in the wider U.S. Iran confrontation. And that's exactly why the war reporting gets so fragmented. If readers saw Lebanon, Gaza, and Iran as one connected strategic theater, they might start asking whether these are really defensive actions at all, or whether they are part of a regional pressure architecture that keeps expanding under different names. You can see the same pattern in the way the news is framed. Israeli escalation is described as a response to threats. Civilian deaths are described as tragic but unavoidable. The occupation keeps widening, but the vocabulary stays narrow. That is why the people on the receiving end of these strikes often sound more realistic than the diplomats. They are not talking about process. They are talking about whether homes, roads, ports, and hospitals still exist by the end of the week. This is where the media layer becomes impossible to ignore. Trump posts a long theatrical message about Iran surrendering, and then posts nearly the same thing again days later. At the same time, mainstream reporting says U.S. intelligence believes Iran still has a large share of its missile inventory and is rebuilding faster than expected. Those two facts don't fit together neatly with the White House's victory tone, so instead of correcting the mismatch, the politics of the moment often just repeats the loudest claim until it sounds normal. That is a problem because the public ends up hearing two very different stories. One says the U.S. is in control and the adversary is collapsing. The other says the conflict is still active, the adversary is adapting, and the negotiation is fragile. The same thing happens in the regional story. On one side, Washington says the Strait of Hormuz must stay open one way or another. On the other, Iran says it will not impose tolls on shipping, but it also insists on control, compensation, and an end to the blockade before a deal can hold. Those are not small differences in policy. They are competing claims over sovereignty and leverage. And while all of that is unfolding, Rubio's India trip is quietly part of a related strategy: critical minerals, supply chain resilience, and protecting against single-source monopolies. That may sound unrelated, but it isn't. The same governments pushing for stability in shipping lanes are also trying to secure the materials that power semiconductors, defense systems, batteries, and advanced industry. In other words, this is a global contest over choke points, just with different packaging. So the big missing piece in a lot of mainstream coverage is not just context, it is motive. These stories are often presented as if the goal is de-escalation, when the actual pattern suggests something more complicated. Preserve leverage, keep the pressure on, and shape the post-war map before anyone can challenge it. That is why the language matters so much. Self-defense strikes, temporary framework, evacuation notice, buffer zone, board of peace. Each term sounds controlled, each term hides violence. And once you start paying attention to that pattern, the headlines become a lot less reassuring. The Iran talks are real, but they are happening under active military pressure, not in a calm diplomatic environment. Gaza's ceasefire is being used to build berms, fortify bases, and permanently divide territory. Lebanon shows the same pattern: escalation, displacement, and civilian destruction, wrapped in the language of security. Mainstream coverage often reports the events, but not the architecture behind them. The common thread is leverage: who controls the map, the ports, the food supply, and the story. That's the part worth keeping in mind as this week keeps moving. The headlines may change, but the machinery underneath keeps grinding forward. If you got value from this breakdown, like the video, subscribe to Daily News, and drop a comment with the one detail you think most outlets are still missing. And in the next one, we'll keep following where these negotiations go once the slogans run out and the real terms come into focus.